and welcome. I'm Nicole Sandford, Ellig Group's Executive Vice President and Board Services Leader. Thank you for joining us today for a webinar, which is part of a series of events, virtual events that Ellig Group has created for forums to discuss leadership and resilience during the COVID-19 worldwide pandemic. I encourage you to listen to the replays of earlier events, which are all available on our website, hosted by myself and our CEO, Janice Ellig. Today's topic is a really timely topic around building trust in the midst of crisis. For the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to explore the current state of public trust in our leaders, in our institutions, and in the context of three different crises that we find ourselves navigating through, which of course are the COVID-19 pandemic, the global economic downturn, and social unrest in the US and around the world. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Russell Dubner, the US CEO and a 25-year veteran of Edelman, a global communications firm that partners with leading businesses and organizations to evolve, promote, and protect their brands and reputations. In addition to overseeing Edelman's largest region, Russell counsels a wide range of clients such as Samsung, REI, PwC, Mitsubishi, Nationwide, and a number of young high-growth companies. He recently established Edelman's performance communications offering, a first-of-its-kind application of emerging communications, data, and technology to cultivate and engage earned audiences. Russell, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking time. I'm sure that you've got plenty to do these days, so appreciate the time.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's definitely, it's busy times for those of us who are in the crisis and issues communications world right now with twin crises, or the three crises that you talk about. And what I'm going to do, is Nicole and I spoke about before, is I'll run through research that we've done on two pieces of that puzzle: the issues around COVID and trust in institutions, and as well as how trust can impact and the roles of brands related to the challenges with social justice. We've been studying trust for 20 years, and what we do is we look at trust in institutions, NGO, business, media, and government, and to understand it sort of a barometer, barometrically, what is the direction of trust in those institutions? Do you trust them to do the right thing? And what we found back in January at our 20th anniversary of this is that there was a real rise in trust in business and an expectation and permission set for business to really step up and battle a whole set of changes, and the notion of stakeholder capitalism was really taking hold. Fast forward to our research in May, as we're looking at the impacts of COVID, we did a mid-year update, something we haven't done in the past, but we talked to about 30,000 people globally from 24 markets, and we'll give you a sense of what we heard and what we've seen. So if you can go to the next slide. So the big takeaway was that trust in government jumped by 11 points. And so for the first time, I think since 2008, and the only other time, that government outstripped all of the other institutions, and at the highest point in the 20 years of research. Our sense is the reason for this is that people realized that the size and scope of COVID could really only be handled by government. That was the institution that they most trusted across the board, both in terms of economically, in terms of health, in terms of jobs and employment. So it's at a different moment in time and a different chapter. So if we go to the next slide, I think what's interesting when you look at it here in the US, well, first of all, we were one of only 2 countries where we were in the distruster category. And so while we're on that bottom of that list, only lower on the list was Japan. At the same time, we have this challenge of trust in local government versus trust in federal government. So we've got a 20-point gap here, where the trust in federal government is at 46 and local government at 66. So we have this bifurcation in where people are looking to solve that problem, and in the US, a concern about where that leadership can come from. We turn to the next slide. return to the notion of business. So as I said in January, there was this high expectation and hope that business was going to be able to step up. And in some ways, I think early on in COVID, you saw this once in a century opportunity for business to show that it really is living stakeholder capitalism. But ultimately, they were seen as really not putting people before profits, not doing enough to protect their employees, not doing enough to help small business, and that ultimately business was still in the business of their own bottom line. We looked at some sector level cuts of this. I think a few exceptions around that in particular were the biopharma space. I think there's a lot of hope and belief that science could come to the rescue. And then early on, we saw the same thing for technology, that technology could be used for good. We're seeing some, what we expect, backlash on that front. But here's a point where business was up, doing their best, and then went quiet. There was a period where there was no CEOs stepping up and penning op-eds in any of the major papers for almost 3 weeks. So, business had gotten quiet. I think that's changed during this moment of social justice questioning and introspection, but we'll get to that in a minute. So I don't know if you get questions along the way, Nicole, please just flag them for me. And in the meantime, I'll keep going. I think this one is really critical for the leaders who are part of this discussion today. So CEOs are expected, 65% of the 30,000 people we spoke to expect CEOs to take the lead on addressing the pandemic. So the vast majority of the citizens that we spoke to really believe that private industry has an obligation to lead. And unfortunately, CEOs are ranked last in those that they think have had an outstanding performance during the time of COVID. So this is a moment where people believe that CEOs have the torch that should be running forward, but don't think that they're doing enough, that they're really focused on the bottom line. Now, fair or unfair, this is a moment where so many businesses, are incredibly challenged in, frankly, just surviving, let alone thriving. The obligation is for those that are doing well to show how this more soft power and capitalism needs to be applied.
So Russell, when you talk to CEOs, which you do every single day, and they see this data, what's the feedback that you get from them? How do they respond?
Yeah, look, the response is twofold. One is they think that the expectations are unfair given the pressure that they're under to deliver on their business. But most want to make sure, even if they're in tough times, that they live up to the obligation of being incredibly transparent. And so what they're looking for is, how do you do that? How do you show empathy? They realize that the CEO also means Chief Empathy Officer, and they're just looking for ways to show that they're listening, show that they care. People need to know that they are human and humane. So that's a chunk of the conversations. The other is, so we ask them, how do you want to be known? What do you want to be remembered for doing in the time of COVID? And I think that question's been helpful because it can cause a management team, a CEO or board to stop and say, yes, we're doing all of the foundational things that need to be done, but are we really living our company soul and our brand promise? So let's turn the chapter and talk a little bit about the brands and racial justice. I think you'll find the set of research really interesting. We've had over 100 conversations with our C-suite clients in the last 2 weeks. And there are a host of issues we're grappling with our clients. Literally, I've been on a phone most of the day today, and we have a fantastic team that's trying to work these through. And frankly, there's no proven path here. And so navigating your way through this, there's not a formula of how to do it clearly. I think everyone was incensed, disgusted to see the continued systematic, racial and racism in our society and in policing. And so at that moment, we wanted to make sure we understood, because our belief was that companies needed to be heard, they needed to stand up and be seen. But what does that mean for brands themselves? Because some of our clients said, oh, well, that's for corporate to do. But many of the clients have a whole series of brands. So do the brands also need to have a voice and stand up? So what we found, if you turn to the next slide, is that 60% of the people we spoke to believe that brands do need to stand up and be heard and to speak out on racial injustice. And if you look at it across race and ethnicity, you can see that it's a majority of white Americans, of course, Black Americans, but also a range of Americans of color. And the same if you look from a age perspective, you see the younger audiences all the more interested in making sure that brands really stand for something, that this notion of brands equaling societal action and brand activism is really important.
Yeah, I think it points to how important it is to really understand your audience and in your customers, your employee base, the constituencies that you're trying to communicate with, because you see very different, while across the board, it seems pretty clear that everyone believes there should be some program to address this at the corporate level. When you get down into those brands, I think understanding your demographics really matters in crafting what you want to say.
Yeah, and a lot of this is really about, as much about action as anything else. And what we're finding right now with a few companies that are grappling with this is that they are concerned they might offend some of their consumers by saying, for instance, that they believe that Black Lives Matter. They're concerned that that might also imply that they are advocating a quote unquote defunding of the police versus, knowing that the two are not necessarily linked in standing with and for the Black community and being an ally. And also not understanding to your point, where the consumer is today, where their consumer is today. And a lot of this, the way I think clients find their courage is by talking to their employees. And usually the employee base has an echo of their consumer base. But we see, we're talking to 2 or 3 clients today that aren't sure they can take that step forward. And I think at this point, it's really, as long as they do it in a way that fits their brand, and we can talk about the ways that can manifest. So we're at this point, but really understanding where your constituent, where your consumer is coming from, I think is incredibly important for COVID as well.
Mm-hmm. Right, and not just because you want the message to stick, but also because presumably you want whatever you decide to do to be successful. And so sort of meeting people where they are is really important, I think, is really more of what I think we're talking about here, as opposed to, sort of pandering your opinion or what you put out to a certain segment of the population. It's really about, if you want to be effective in your messaging and you want to be effective in whatever it is you choose to do to support various efforts and activism, you have to kind of know where you're starting from. So I think it's very powerful information.
Yeah, and there are some clients who know that their track record in this regard is not, they don't have their house fully in order. Right. And what we've told them is that doesn't stop you from speaking from your heart, making sure you're speaking to and for your employees in this moment, and just stay true to, at the same time, who your brand is. If as a brand, you've been more about the environment, well, any check you might write, which is, that's less of a sacrifice than taking action, should be tied to that and the Black community. And so there are different ways that can manifest, but a brand like Dove and their Dove Men Plus Care, they're all about the dad and the parent. And so the work we've done for them is literally helping fathers who've been killed by Black fathers who've been killed by police, and giving monies and giving them support, and their family, giving their family support in this moment in time. And now they're committed to that on a multi-year basis. So that's an instance where they can go directly towards the problem. In other instances, a client like PayPal, they're putting their dollars against the venture side. How can they economically look at ways that they can help Black entrepreneurs who could use that seed funding to bring economic opportunity to the Black community? So I think there are a whole host of ways this manifests, and you do see some strong momentum, and you see the rhetoric that's coming out. And the question now will be how many companies are able to kind of take that forward over time. I think if you look at the downside risk, go to the next slide, for those companies and brands that are not sure it's going to be worth the risk or concerned about the downside, you can see that the reward for taking action and for standing up is there's a 4x potential bump in trust that you will earn by speaking your truth versus a potential downside, which is, by and large, negligible. So again, if this is a place where as an organization, your employees, the CEO, the leadership can get aligned, it's an area where, yes, it's sensitive ground. Yes, it's hard to find the right words. Yes, the conversations can be incredibly upsetting, and it could be a moment where also at the same time, an organization can come together and find its humanity.
Right.
I think we just go to the next slide, and then can take some more questions. So we asked about why is this important, and what came to the top was a moral obligation. Second is that taking this action and taking this stance is something that companies owe to its employees and brands owe to its employees. And then there are other components of this in terms of filling government voids and alike. So moral obligation and owe it to their employees is really the predominant reason that people believe that companies and brands should step up. Right.
Well, it's really interesting. I do have a few questions here. I'm going to start with one you just touched on a little bit, which was around sort of downside risk. But the question is, given the responses by a number of CEOs, and there's examples here, Reed Hastings from Netflix, Brian Moynihan from Bank of America, Mary Barra, who's been really visible. Will the trust in CEOs, in your opinion, go up? And do people believe there's staying power in the commitments from the CEOs?
I think the skeptics will say this is rhetoric and not enough action. I don't think we've seen a moment like this before. And so these are serious people who want to deliver change. So I think that, time will tell, but I believe that the follow through is going to be there. And I guess I'm an optimist in this moment. So will trust go up? I think trust will only go up if there's sustained action. And I'm pretty optimistic that that's going to take place. I know at Edelman, we're a part of the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, and we just signed on to put a set of fellows, aligned to policy activism in this, and there were easily another 200 companies who had raised their hand to do the same.
Right. I have another question, but it is interesting. I wanted to, something just occurred to me before I go to that one, which is in the data that you presented earlier, and when you showed the responses to the question around should companies stand up and make a statement by age, and you see, not surprisingly highest for the younger group, and it kind of goes down from there. But if you assume most CEOs or sort of, visible corporate leaders are in that band of, somewhere between the 54 and the 55 plus band that you have, I think those numbers tell the story too about we just happen to have a younger set of leaders perhaps, and that's why there's more of a commitment. And I agree with you 100%. It's all going to come down to whether there's action on the other side of the commitments and as to whether the brand, the trust goes up or down. There's another question here that I think is really one of the ones that we all struggle with a little bit. Companies find themselves in the position of being criticized for not being on one side or the other. And the example here is for police or against police. Another example you might say is for controlling the virus or for the economy, right? And so there's sort of this binary trend in our world right now, especially in the US. How do we help companies to navigate that? Because in most of these cases, it's not an either or choice. It's just been positioned that way.
The notion here is that you really need to stand for what you're for, less so about what you're against. And I think that being really clear in that and choosing the place that you're willing to take a stand to advance your positive agenda, that's really at the core. And I don't think that companies need to make a false choice. How do they feel about systematic racism that takes place around elements of policing is different. But I don't think that that question is really going to be asked. What they really need to grapple with is how are they handling things first and foremost in their four walls? And then secondly, what can they do in the world outside them? And as long as they're making a sacrifice to make change so that people know that they mean it and they're just not writing a general check, I think that they'll be rewarded.
Right. So curious, you've seen 19 years or so of this data. What's the most surprising thing about what you're seeing now in the trust barometer, or what do you think is the most interesting for where we are and where we go from here?
Yeah, well, from both of these research, there are two things that stood out for me. One was, what a boost government got versus business. I honestly didn't expect that to happen because we've seen so many of our clients trying to live the promise of business. They recognize that capitalism itself is being questioned. And so they're doing everything in their power to do good. And so I think for a lot of CEOs, this must be, and for boards, it must be incredibly frustrating to see how much they're doing for society, for their employees, and to not get recognized for it. But I think it's the don't expect for a thank you. Recognize you just have to do the right thing, and over time, have thick skin but a true heart. I think the second part of this, in terms of social justice, the amount of commonality and support for companies and brands to stand up. We've seen this trend happening over years, but this is a real spike, and I do think it's a unique moment in time because it's captured people's attention at a moment where they have time to really take action, peacefully protest, and really push for change.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about resilience? And there are certainly, you kind of alluded to it earlier, companies who don't have their own house in order are concerned about taking a stand, and how you advise them. Let's talk about how that changes if you're talking about a company that maybe took a stand that was criticized early on. You're welcome to give examples if you want, but you don't have to. But how do you help a company to right the ship if the early statements that they made either didn't land or worse, landed in the wrong way?
We've seen more of instances where companies have taken a stutter step before making their position known. And that if you had scenario planned, you would know there was a reasonable degree of likelihood that something was going to happen. If you have enough stores, someone's going to show up with, Black Lives Matter apparel who's on your workforce or whatever it might be. And so there really is a decision to be made. And if you don't make that decision, then you find yourself, you can be on an intense defense. So knowing where you're going to stand, even if you don't take a stand. And so that's been probably one of the most challenging things that we've seen clients come to, because it's not, their employees aren't going to be uniform in their view. So the company or the brand really needs to ultimately make that decision for themselves, knowing there's no way in this hyper-polarized world that they're going to make everyone happy.
Russell, was there more content that you wanted to cover, or did I interrupt you, or did we get to?
No, there's a kind of a roadmap on the last slide.
Yeah, let's take a look at that, and then we'll take some more questions.
So what we're hearing from people is that you really need to use your power of influence to create change. That's what they're asking. This isn't sort of our recommendation, but that's the ask of the people that we polled. They're saying here that this is about as much educating and advocating as anything else, that for companies and brands in particular who have billions of dollars of ad spend, think about how you can use those dollars in a way that is of use. And in terms of your own house in order, don't be afraid to take a brave stand. Just make sure that you are taking action and that you're taking it seriously. We have a client we're working on right now where they know they have an issue, but they're not willing to, in terms of getting their house in order, be transparent and assertive enough of when that change will happen. In those instances, you are at risk because you're not making a full commitment around the change. And then ultimately, you're going to be judged. The consumer is going to judge you if you don't take clarity of that action, and they'll judge you if you don't stand up. And that's been made really clear. And there are a lot of instances you can see right now where brands are making changes to the imagery on their packaging. And we've been helping some clients think through that. And then what will that mean? What will the identity of that brand mean going forward? And really, what does it mean for them to even take that stand in of itself?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really helpful. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball a little bit here, but certainly many of your clients had strategic priorities around what they were looking to do before all of these things started happening. And that maybe most companies have probably put a pin in some of those things because of the environment. What is the timeline that you think people are looking at before they can start to be in the market in a more commercial way, in talking more about their business and their strategic priorities? When do we get to maybe start thinking, even if you can't tell me when, what are you looking for in advising companies when these things happen, we can start to go back to, being more commercial in our messaging?
Yeah. We've seen before the George Floyd's death, you had a whole host of companies who were using this as a moment to floor it on their digital transformation. So we saw clients like Taco Bell who went fast into contactless pickup. You saw companies who were looking to push their e-commerce very swiftly, and so being commercial in a different way. There were clients like eBay who were helping people on Main Street. Stores were shut down to create a storefront for free on eBay to help them find their feet. So in these moments, it's still commercial. It's just commercial and filling a very clear need for their consumer or for their customer. And those are the companies I think are thriving right now. In terms of a commercial message, I think there was a time where it was a general sort of thank you that was happening, and I think people frankly tired of that over a period, and right now they want to know, well, what are you doing, or what are you doing to be helpful? I think there is some room for levity, and that's around like what's your lived experience right now, and you have to be really careful with that. But I do think people are still looking for a way to take a deep breath at times. But in terms of being sort of, return to normal, I don't think there is a return to normal. I think we have to think of it as sort of a, welcome forward. And we have to look at how the consumer, how your employees have changed in their expectations, and realize that, what was, even at a company level, ESG now, we know what the S stands for, and that's social justice.
Right. Yeah, we've all been wondering, right? It was the last shoe to drop, I guess. But, I love the phrase that you used earlier, chief empathy officer. I think that's really interesting. I think we're looking at a point in time where some things have sort of come together in order to bring us to a point where leaders are looking at their role in a different way. And a big part of that, I think, is the institutional investor movement towards ESG investing, which, would love to have any input that you have on how your clients are talking to their investors, because that conversation is very different, I'm sure. But I love that term. So, talk to me about how your CEOs react when you use that term with them.
For many CEOs who haven't been in this sort of predicament before, you see the light bulb go off, and they recognize that, they have really two jobs right now. One is to run the business, and the other is to be a leader for their people in a way that isn't just about strategy. It's about meeting them where they are emotionally. And that means that they have to be all the more vulnerable. I do think the fact that everyone is sort of quote unquote meeting from, their kids' TV room or their home office does make a difference. And in some ways it's enabled CEOs to put their guard down. And all the more, I think, once they spend time with the frontline worker, we do a whole bunch of work for Petco, and their CEO very willing to get out there, be with the essential worker. And I think that makes a difference. When they had to furlough a host of employees, they knew it wasn't being done from an ivory tower. And I think that makes a huge difference.
Right. Very true. Well, we are at our time here. So I'm going to thank you once again for joining us today, and to all of our participants for joining and to sending in questions. I've been a big fan of this research for a very long time. I can remember sort of Sarbanes-Oxley era when you guys did the barometer, and being really sort of shocked at the results, and following it ever since. So big fan of what you all have been doing and appreciate you taking some time to share your viewpoints and insights with our participants.
Great. Well, thank you, Nicole, for having me. Really appreciate the forum and the platform, and hopefully you all find data useful and some of the inspiration from what some of our clients have been up to.
Thank you, Russell. And for those of you who are looking for the slides and the reports, we will send a package of information out to you after the webinar. So thank you all so much. And Russell, have a wonderful day.